So earlier before the break, you've heard some trends, and we've outlined some trends and patterns that we were able to identify around domestic homicide in Canada generally and for specific populations. We want to turn now to 4 individuals who have been key contributors to the work of the CDHP-IVP from the beginning, and we have asked them to join us today to provide further insights on what else we need to know about data and data collection, about definitions of domestic homicide, and where we need to go from here. So I'll just introduce you to the members of the panel. In the top, I guess if you're facing the screen, in your top left is Christel Gisbret, is a Director of Research and Communications with the Provincial Association of Transition Houses and Services of Saskatchewan. Welcome, Christel. In your top right is Anuradha Dugal, is a Vice President, Community Initiatives with the Canadian Women's Foundation and currently responsible for national strategies related to gender equality. Welcome. In your bottom left is Claudette Dumont-Smith. She's the former Executive Director of the Native Women's Association of Canada and is currently the co-chair on the Federal Sub-Working Group to develop a national action plan in response to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Inquiry calls for justice. Welcome, Claudette. And finally, in the bottom right, we have Wendy Verhoek Afdal, and she is the Investigation Research Representative in the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, Prince Edward Island. Welcome, Wendy. Our program provides further information on these key experts in the area of domestic homicide and domestic violence prevention if you want to go to your program. So today what we're going to do over the next 60 minutes or so is we've asked them to reflect on 4 key questions, and we'll spend about 15 minutes on each of those questions that relate to definitions and to data. And then we invite you to actually, reflect in the chat box, but also they'll be available in the pop-in sessions that we begin at 4:15. Each of them will be in an individual pop-in session, so you can feel free to go into one or more of them at 4:15 if you want to have the opportunity to ask further questions or discuss any of their comments further. Myself and Danielle and Jordan will also be in one of the pop-out sessions. So what I'll do right now is I'm going to go right into question 1. We'll spend about 15 minutes on each question, asking each of the panelists to reflect for 3 or 4 minutes on that particular question. So we'll go right into question 1 and we can go back to the panel. So what is missing from the definitions that we have discussed around domestic homicide? And we'll go first to Claudette. We'll begin this round with Claudette.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to participate in today's event. I think what's missing in the definitions is the identification of the subgroups of the Indigenous population in Canada. We can't lump Indigenous people under the umbrella Indigenous. We have to be more specific and be more distinctions-based. That is, we should identify if they're First Nations, if they're Inuit, or if they're Métis. These are the groups that are identified as to our constitution of who makes up the Indigenous population of Canada, and there's differences in the 3 groups, and I think that there is a call by each of the groups that they be identified based on their distinctions. So I think that when we look at definitions on domestic violence and that, we have to make sure that these distinctions are respected throughout because of what I just said, because there's differences in places of where they live, how they're governed. For example, I'll give you an example. First Nations fall under the jurisdiction of the Indian Act and have been so since 1867. The Inuit no, and the Métis no. So there's very different circumstances affecting each population, and the more that you can put that in define that, I think the better information we'll have in order to address the high rates of violence that are occurring in those populations. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll come back to it if anybody has any questions. I'll answer as best as I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudette. I think that's a very important point, the distinctions-based aspect of data collection, not sort of treating all groups as essential or homogenized groups. Thank you. Moving on to Anuradha. What is missing from the definitions in your perspective?
So I'd say one of the first things that struck me in the data that was being shared was that a lot of this information is restricted to what has been made public, and that in some cases there's also estimates being made. So for refugee and immigrant populations, relying on media reports as a source of data, while is important because there's very few other things available. We know, for example, that Stats Canada doesn't calculate homicide rates for immigrant and refugee populations. So we have to find the data somewhere. But what's unfortunate is that that's also very often tied to biased reporting or a tone or attitude about culture and cultural realities that can lead to assumptions being made about some populations. So while the data is there, it's perhaps not the way I would want it to be developed. A second point around this is that very often undocumented populations are not represented at all. This is an important consideration because we know very often those who are in Canada, either with their status having been expired or with their circumstances changing, that they are now without certain kinds of protections as per their status. And we know that status is also often used as a tool for psychological abuse in abusive relationships. That's a concern as to the fact that they're not visible through the data that we have in front of us right now. And I'd like to see that change. And finally, very much in the way that Claudette described, and with probably very similar colonial roots, just putting together the group immigrant and refugee as a homogenous group means that we very often miss details on how populations are experiencing systemic racism and systemic violence, as well as the violence within abusive relationships. And that's a concern when it comes to when we want to make representational policy requests to an organization like Stats Canada, can you please change how you collect data? We also need to say how we want that data collected.
Thank you very much. I think, some more key points, and I think showing also some of the challenges that are consistent across the two groups. So mentioning the need to distinguish both in the Indigenous populations and with immigrant and refugee populations, the importance of recognizing the differences within those groups. And I think also, touching on the invisibility. So the data sources that we've accessed make some victims and some families experiencing violence very much invisible. So good key points. Thank you, Anu. Crystal.
Thank you. So I'll speak to rural, remote, and northern populations as studied by the CDHPI. So as you heard in the previous presentation, the project defined rural communities as populations under 10,000 or widely dispersed populations. Communities are remote if they don't have year-round road access, and northern includes all of the territories and northern areas of the provinces. There are similarities and overlap between these categories. And for the purpose of the research, it makes sense to investigate rural, remote, and northern as one of the 4 vulnerable populations studied. It's also necessary, however, to break the definition down further. There are significant differences between these communities. Small urban centers with populations in the thousands may have public transportation. They may have specific domestic violence services, including shelters. Other rural communities may be an hour or several hours away from centers where these services are available. And the situation is drastically different in communities without road access or those that are hours and hours away from the nearest small urban center. And it's not just about the size of the community, but the type of the community. Access to services and resources varies across all communities, but there are substantial differences between First Nations and other small communities of a similar size. And that's not just in terms of access to to specific domestic violence services, but access to adequate housing and drinking water and public transportation. Another defining factor for people living in rural, remote, and northern areas is how close your neighbors are. Rural means something different if you live in a small town where there's others nearby versus if you live on a farm that is half an hour from town, if you have a vehicle and depending on the weather. Geographic isolation intersects with cultural factors and community dynamics, as well as victim variables. Decision-making and barriers to accessing support are impacted by the victim's situation, such as if they work in town, or they're a farmer, or they take care of livestock. Further, victims in rural, remote, and northern communities may leave their communities for safety and to access services. So they're receiving services or they're relocating to urban centers. So it's complex. When doing research such as this, it's necessary to group and to categorize so that we can explore themes and see what is common and consistent, to see the gaps and to form recommendations. Because of the numbers and the population and the fact that there are many commonalities, it makes sense to explore rural, remote, and northern as a category, while also acknowledging and exploring the factors that make the communities and the specific situations unique.
Thank you, Crystal. Again, I think what the first three responses have really underscored is how data actually does collapse distinctions. It collapses characteristics that vary across groups. For those of you who know me, I grew up in rural farming community in Prince Edward Island, which is very different than rural prairies or rural northern Ontario. So even rural is so distinct depending on where in the country you are. And I think it also, Crystal's comments bring in the idea around intersections that cross both the distinctions based in Indigenous communities, rural, remote, and northern, et cetera. So really one of the things that we need to recognize in definitions I'm hearing from the panel is that we have broad definitions that very much have to be drilled down into the more distinct aspects. Wendy, can you respond to that and build on what's been said?
Well, I think what concerns me in terms of children is that the best information we have about risk to children is when the victim is high risk. And so I'm just wishing that we could do more drill down to try to identify situations that put children at even increased risk. Just a quick consideration around the definition of DV-associated deaths. The man with the 4-year-old that was identified as having fallen at the bottom of a cliff, that is really, really difficult to determine if that situation is domestic violence related. If you read the information, it talks about it being a very treacherous area after a storm, extremely dangerous, calls into question as, parenting ability, taking a 4-year-old to such a dangerous location. And also impending court proceedings, so like a trigger event. It just so happened that in April of this year in Australia, there was a father who was observed to jump off a cliff with his 9-month-old. And if you look at the risk factors in those two scenarios, they're very similar. So, there may potentially be a missed opportunity to better understand risk to children because we can't include the father that was found at the bottom of a cliff with his 4-year-old. I also feel like, and some of this is what I have seen in some of the custody access situations and other situations where children seem to be at risk, harassing, intimidating behaviors, like what role do those play? And coercive control, I know there's research going on to better operationalize the definition of that. Do those behaviors put children at increased risk? Also, like post-separation forms of abuse for children. So we're very focused on the adult victim and the adult perpetrator, but what are the experiences of children? What's being done to the children? And then how are we assessing the safety and the impact of the exposure to family violence on children? And how might that factor into their additional risk of homicide?
Thank you, Wendy. So again, we see that we need to really treat these cases as very, they do have commonalities across the different definitions that we use, but there's very much variations across the different types or cases that we're coming across. We have about 3 minutes. I'm wondering if any of the comments from the other panelists prompted you to think about something else that you wanted to add with respect to this particular question around definitions. Anybody can pop in if they'd like.
I guess I would like to add to that, especially with the changes in the Divorce Act and a very significant accounting for family violence in custody access arrangements, parenting plans. I think it's really, really important that there are some very good definitions and really good risk assessments and understanding of what needs to be operationalized to really protect children in those situations and really operationalize the best interest of the child. What is that? And we've tended more to look at, start from the beginning, 50-50 planning. We haven't looked that much about areas, and the Divorce Act, I think, does a reasonable job of beginning to lay out where, rather than constant co-parenting where you need permission from one parent to do everything, that most of the time, unless it's a major decision, the recommendation is that the parent that has the day-to-day custody at that moment gets to make some of the basic decisions. So I think that will help, but it's really much more of a focus now on children. So I'm glad to see that.
Great, thank you, Wendy. Okay, so we touched some of the surface issues that are linked to definitions of not only domestic homicide, but definitions of various populations that we might wish to focus on. So I think, we've made that first step into understanding that what we've done is really key, but we really need to make sure that we don't lose the character of what's happening in these cases, because all cases tend to be different. So the second question that we wanted the panel to focus on is, with a project that focused on vulnerable populations or marginalized populations and trying to understand how we can better inform risk assessment and risk management and enhance safety planning, we wanted to have the panelists, dream, which is what we always like to dream of a wish list. So what is missing in information that we currently have? What is your wish list for information that you think would be key to prevention around risk and safety, that if you had a genie in a bottle, that this is what you could tell that genie? So I think here we'll start with Crystal.
Thank you, Myrna. So as mentioned in the previous presentation, low data quality and completeness is a challenge when documenting and examining domestic homicide. Much of the available data comes from court documents and media reports. So we have information on relationship variables, such as if they were married or common law, or if they had separated, but we have far less information on relationship dynamics leading up to the homicide. What comes out in court decisions, what was brought in as evidence, documented in judgments, is often a reflection of what was known and recorded, as well as what is seen as important and relevant to the case. If particular risk factors aren't recognized as relevant, information may not be sought or brought in, and we don't have a complete picture. Also, much of what we know, as has already been acknowledged, comes from media reports, including details that family members and others who are impacted share. The accessibility of rural, remote, and northern communities to members of the media may play a role in covering these stories, as do community-level factors with sharing information. And speaking about the wish list, something that is missing that I hope to see changed in the near future is that Canada currently does not have a criminal code offense of coercive control. It is well documented by research and domestic violence death reviews that coercive controlling violence is a significant risk factor. However, criminal records presently do not reflect the presence of coercive control or other forms of non-physical intimate partner violence. I feel that criminalizing coercive control will improve the quality of data in future research by documenting a really serious form of intimate partner violence that's currently missed in the official records. But also, this will have important implications for safety planning and risk management, as it would enable victims to access protective orders and to put conditions in place for people who perpetrate coercive control. Also, relating to rural, remote, and northern areas, firearms are the most common weapons used, most often long guns. What we don't know is if those firearms were owned legally, We also don't have data regarding previous incidents or indications of unsafe use or threats involving firearms beforehand, or if there were any orders involving surrendering or not possessing firearms. Those are key pieces of information for determining and managing risk posed by people who use violence, particularly in rural communities. And also, again, relating specifically to rural, remote, and northern communities is animal ownership. Prior involvement with animal control or animal welfare organizations was something that the CDHPI flagged as an important variable, but where data was not available in many of the cases. We know from research, including Canadian research, that maltreatment of animals, intimate partner violence, and child maltreatment frequently co-occur. And also, even when animals aren't harmed, ownership of pets and livestock is still a barrier. Other factors that are particularly relevant to rural, remote, and northern areas include precarious employment and unemployment. So we need to take such risks into account when advocating for and designing supports for both victims and perpetrators. To have a complete picture, data collected by various service providers is necessary. I will stop here, but I will note that while it's exceedingly challenging to capture and compile individual level data for both victims and perpetrators, it's even more challenging to quantify data relating to social or to societal level factors of communities.
Thank you, Crystal. Yes, I think, the challenges about individual level data are key in and of themselves, but when we move to community and societal level, it becomes even more of a dilemma that we actually need to address if we're going to progress further. You made some really great points. I just want to pick up one in particular before I move on to Anu, is that, we've had a discussion around the course of controlling behavior offense, and I think there's a key discussion going on around that, but it's interesting to note that we don't even have a domestic violence offense. And so when we think about definitional issues, I think that different cases are being responded to differently across jurisdictions because not all jurisdictions see domestic violence or domestic violence cases in the same way. So we have general offenses being applied to domestic violence related offenses. So some great content that I hope we get a chance to pick up. I'll go over to you, Anu.
Yes, thanks, Myrna. I think when I'm considering just some of the points that Crystal raised, and just to build on them, when it comes to the level of data, one of the things that is noticeable is that when we focus on individuals, sometimes that also leads to a focus on particular cultures, or what tend to get called cultural practices, rather than understanding domestic homicide and domestic violence as an issue within an overarching understanding of using power and control in what's basically a patriarchal system. And this actually manifests in all communities, but in just really different ways. And for me, when I think about the moving from an individual level of understanding to more of a systemic understanding, the understanding how racism gets tied up in that, how different justice or legal services discriminate against refugee and immigrant populations, the barriers towards accessing different kinds of support depending on language or depending on location, sometimes social location, but also so level of education, but also geographically where people find themselves physically in the country. Those are all, they can all add up to systemic barriers that are really important to understand, because when we understand what's happening now, it helps us then be able to use that general understanding for a way of making change in the future. And I think that's beyond the individual things, which I'm going to talk more about now. Those more systemic areas are really a high concern. So what some of the more other things on my wish list would include which communities might be most affected. Is it to do with perhaps a regionalism? Is it regional to Canada? Is it region to place of origin? Are some communities seem to be more targeted? Is there linguistic specific support for certain types of communities versus others? How long victims or perpetrators lived in Canada? And are they immigrants, refugees, permanent residents, Canadian citizens at the point? Because those factors of integration, the stresses of migration, asylum claims, can all be relevant in trying to understand why fatal violence is being used. And therefore, it builds on our prevention initiatives moving forward. I also think I would like to see an awful lot more information on those who use violence. There's a lot of gaps in understanding why and who. Was there any help available? Where would this help have come from? Because I think we need to be able, in the immigrant and refugee communities, we know that asking for help and reaching out to legal systems are barriers in themselves because of systemic discrimination and racism within police and law courts, and as well as taboo and stigmatization within the community. And so what can communities already be doing to help those who are using violence and to put in preventive measures at that point? Those are all things that I think if we knew more about the whole picture, we would just have more avenues that we could intersect and make change.
Thank you. Again, many good points, and I think very much underscoring, one of the lenses that I mentioned that we looked at through this work with, is social ecological lens that does include the individual and the relationships, but also includes the communities. Because as you say, if we have communities that have services, but we have experiences of racism and discrimination, whether it's a woman experiencing violence or an accused reaching out for help, then those services they're not going to be able to address the prevention goals that they had. And I think it's very much starting to look at what communities share or don't share in terms of what resources they have available to fight or to respond to violence in their communities. So again, great comments. Wendy, would you like to weigh in on your wish list?
I would like to see more consistent use of more formal risk assessment tools, because I feel like there's a lot of variability and the tools have various purposes. And so I think it's important to actually acknowledge that. And so if it's a tool that's being used by police in the moment, that's helpful in the moment. The question is, if you're managing a family over time, what is that adequate as a risk assessment if you're able to, in that moment, address the risk? I know that the risk assessment tools don't take into account risk for children. There is a matrix called Barnardo's matrix that was developed in the UK, but it's not validated yet. But I think that would be pretty important to put something together to look at validating that assessment tool. It includes specific factors for children, such as how are they experiencing the violence? Are they fearful? Are they experiencing child abuse, neglect? Are they able to implement safety strategies? Are they more likely to intervene and put themselves at risk? So, because when we're doing our risk assessments, we're more looking at the interactions between the adults and risky adults. We're not looking at integrating what's happening with the children at the same time. The tool also has some protective factors, which I think are helpful for people that are doing safety planning and risk management. And it also incorporates some of the social determinants of health. So looks at housing instability, poverty, social networks, culture and language barriers, which is like an overlay on the tool and saying that these are all considerations when you're using the tool. I feel like I don't have also, if we're doing risk management and safety planning, we need to be working across sectors. Because part of the risk management is keeping an eye on how things are going, and if there's triggering events, that changes risk. And so I think we still have a little bit more of the risk in the moment and not so much coordination around changes that could happen in that risk. The other thing that we haven't really done a lot with or talked a lot about part of the risk management and safety planning is what's happening if a perpetrator needs to be removed from a home, even temporarily. Is there some of the research indicates that if there are some services provided in terms of making sure that there's safety planning about how that person, what steps they'll take not to perpetrate that violence again. Do they have stability in terms of housing, good employment? Do they need mental health services, addiction services? Those are important because someone that's already highly stressed and agitated can precipitate even further violence and further endanger the family. And if there are breaches of orders, how are we responding to that? We often hear that there are breaches and we're not responding to that. So how do we hold people accountable while supporting them to make better choices? And then parenting, like what is their relationship with the children? And I honestly don't know, like really, what are we missing that puts children at increased risk of homicide? So when it's familicide and all the family members are killed, sometimes children are killed and sometimes they're not. Can we figure out why? I mean, we want to stop all the homicides, and then in situations where children are killed and the adult victim is not, like, can we drill down and figure out what's going on so we can prevent those homicides?
Yeah, a good point. I think we do know there's a variety of risk assessment tools out there, some formal and some less formal. But we also are seeing an increasing recognition that risk is not static, but it's very fluid, and the need to sort of assess that fluidity, including the role of children in those relationships. Claudette, what is on your wish list?
My wish list would be that every community, First Nations community, and there's about 600, and take some or leave some, should have a risk assessment done for the women that are experiencing violence in their lives. And the risk assessment has to be modeled on what is available in that particular community, because it varies from community to community. You have very sophisticated communities, then you have communities where there are only 100 people, and they're fly-in communities. So each risk assessment tool has to be framed around what's in the community, and the safety plan has to be developed as, based on that information. And there should be a safety plan for each community, because violence happens in those communities, and the women have to, be brought to safety. So I would like to see that in each community. And another thing I find that when we look at the higher numbers of murdered First Nations, Métis, or Inuit women, we don't know where the homicides occurred. And I think that's very valid information. Is that happening on the reserves, in the Inuit communities, in the Métis settlements, or is it happening like in urban settings? This is very important information if we want to help the women not get murdered. So I think that we need a lot more. There's a lot of information missing. We need to develop the risk management, safety planning based on the communities, on the information of the communities, what the community can do to ensure that safety of the women and her children. And I think right now we're just playing a guessing game because we don't know. Each community is different, and we're working from a mindset that every community is similar to one another, and that's not the case. So we have to come in with that knowledge, I think, in order that we can really assess those factors and provide the best services possible. So it's a lot, but I think when you look at the continuing high rates of violence, of murders of Indigenous women, this is information that we really need, and I think we're lacking right now.
Thank you very much, Claudette. I think, I really like the concept of thinking about risk assessment, less about an individual and more, or, in addition to the individual involved, thinking about the community risk assessment. What does the community have that both protects against or facilitates violence in the lives of people who live in that community? I think that's a really important concept for us to take away because we understand that we still focus on individual level factors. So I see that we have about 15 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is sort of collapse the last two questions and say, of your wish list, tell me what would be your key priority moving forward. And if you have an idea, sort of pulling in question 4, with that priority, do you see an avenue for more innovative approaches to collecting data to get at that priority? So what is your priority from the wish list that you talked about? Pick one that you think is the core one that you'd like to focus on, and how might we in a more innovative way get better data around that priority? So we'll start here with Anu.
Thank you, Myrna. I think one of my, the biggest things that I would like to see in data collection moving forward is more breakdown on where racialized populations intersect with immigrant and refugee populations, because I think sometimes there's a misconception or a collapsing of immigrant with racialized or refugee with racialization. And then some of the things get missed. I would take as an example Black communities in Canada, which have long roots in certain parts of Canada and are not in any way a refugee or an immigrant population. They're a racialized community who experience particular types of anti-Black racism within the legal structures and within education, within social services. And so how to understand how those intersections are either a barrier, I'm going to make an assumption and say are very often a barrier to getting help and support so that we can better understand how to address populations. And I was thinking about some of the conversations we've had before about if this project came up with naming populations now, how different it might be 6 years on, and especially in light of all of the things that have happened over the last year, in particular because of COVID and our understanding of the disproportionate effects on different populations. So I think that's a really interesting data avenue to explore further. And LGBTQ populations would be another one. It's very much a taboo subject in some immigrant, refugee, and racialized communities. And so being responsive to understanding how these, just like undocumented, how not to invisibilize certain groups within other groups, while at the same time not outing groups or making them further vulnerable. That's a really difficult line to walk. And if I had a dream as to how that might happen, I think it would be to work with groups on the ground who are well connected with populations, particularly those who are immigrant-led or those who are LGBTQ-led, to undertake a data collection process that really respects where they're at and understands the needs of their communities and that supports their safety needs. I think there's artisan-based type programs, arts type-based ways of bringing people together and exploring their situations that can promote women's safety while working with community leaders and religious leaders. Also in many refugee and immigrant communities, that would also require working with traditional leaders and religious leaders. So those are some ideas. I'm not sure they were very centralized, but before I sign off, I do want to thank women who have personally shared their stories with me, because I feel as if their stories and their realities live on in my mind and in my heart as I do this work. And I just really want to thank them for their generosity in sharing that.
Thank you. I think you were very succinct, and I think you made a lot of really great points. And as you were talking, I was thinking about two time periods, the time period maybe 25 years ago when there was a whole sort of an informal ban on collecting racialized statistics, and now there's a call for it. But the recognition that we can't go back to the way they used to be collected. It has to be collected in a way that's responsible to the communities that that we want to sort of see about enhancing prevention. So I I really like your sort of, it's a grassroots focus, grassroots movements in terms of building and pushing forward on collecting data, not necessarily from the top down, but from the bottom up. And I think that's really core. And I think you mentioned both racialized and immigrant and refugee and LGBTQ plus. I mean, those are groups that often don't, the data collection is really unreliable for various reasons. So if you moved out a bottom up approach, it would potentially move us in a direction that would be really helpful. So thank you. If we can go to Wendy, please. One priority and how you would move forward.
I think nationally, probably what would hold, and really focusing on the data, what would help hold the most promise, I think, would be to work with the existing provincial, territorial, domestic violence death review and child death review committees that have access to probably the most in-depth information available from a wide range of sources. Also, child and youth advocate death reviews, although related to reviewable services, which tend to be whether a child has received any child welfare services, also have access to a lot of very rich information. And I think that it would give information on regional differences. I think the information could be used to develop like a standard set of definitions and variables that would be used across the various programs. So it wouldn't take away from what a review does, but ask them to consider using these more standardized variables and looking at the intersectionality. So you would be able to, I mean, we don't have large numbers, but over time, look at cultural differences, sets of the Indigenous population on or off reserve, and better identify what some of these risk factors are, and also incorporate in, I mean, at different levels of government, there are statistics in terms of levels of poverty, levels of education, food insecurity, and so incorporate that, but also be careful in terms of analysis. So look to control for the various variants. I know sometimes when you just do a very basic analysis, like, oh, everything's associated with poverty and food insecurity, but it's more complicated than that. So I think if we really want to address the issues, we need to be gathering more information, more consistent information that enables us to parse out and factor in information at the various levels of like the social ecological model.
Great, thank you, Wendy. And yes, we do have domestic violence death review committees and child death review committees in various jurisdictions across the country and in other countries. And so that would be an avenue for moving forward, recognizing that currently some jurisdictions don't have it, so there'd be some sort of geographic inequity that maybe we could address over time. Claudette, your priority and some suggestions for moving forward with that.
I really agree with what Wendy was saying, but I think that for when it comes to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, there should be like a centrally based data structure, whereby there would be all types of information on the victims as well as the perpetrators, where it happened, how it happened, the circumstances surrounding the events. The more information we have, I think, on both the victim, the perpetrators, and the circumstances, places where they live, what was available where in the places that they live, I think that's only then will we be able to develop programs or services that will meet their needs. But again, I think that everything has to come from the community. It has to be community driven. The community has to be involved as well. All the data that's collected has to be owned by Indigenous population, because the sharing of information with the mainstream often gets lost. So there's the First Nations, the Inuit and the Métis people want to have that information so that they can address their population, the needs of their population that are being affected by the high rates of violence and of homicide. So I think we should have something that's very national in scope, but that is really, that works with all the regions across Canada, much as Wendy said, and that we get as much information as possible on similar to what is done in domestic violence death reviews. I think that should be done with the Indigenous population as well, because without that, we're just not going to get at the root of solving the issue and of decreasing the rates of homicides and violence against Indigenous women in Canada. So I'm really for that, for getting that information, data, some kind of a national database structure in place, and the sooner I think the better.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're underscoring a couple of things that the other panelists have said, and we mentioned before in terms of we're actually talking about two things. We're talking about accessibility of data and then availability of data. So we can collect this data, but I think a number of you have mentioned that it's important to have the communities involved, and so have that data be community driven. But it's also important for those communities to have access to that data in terms of being able to understand what their communities need in terms of prevention. So available data is only useful if it's actually accessible to the communities who need it. Thank you, Claudette. Crystal, your priority and your potential avenue for moving forward to address that priority.
Thank you. And I think my priority and where I think we need to go fits really well with what my fellow panelists have said and where you just led us, Myrna. One thing I think we need to inform prevention is we need data on services, including police and support services, if they were accessed by victims or perpetrators before the homicide, and if so, how recently, and the outcomes of those interactions. But moreover, when we're looking at rural, remote, and northern communities, we need to know how many options were realistically available and accessible, including RCMP and shelters and violence treatment programs for people who use violence, because that will help to understand barriers to reporting and seeking support, and barriers related to gaps in services and availability of transportation, which will help, I think, to inform recommendations for intervention in rural, remote, and northern communities. But what we need to do to do this, I think part of the challenge is that researchers have ideas of variables that are relevant to understand the dynamics of intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide and the data that is needed. But as we've been discussing, challenges exist with completeness and accessibility of the data. Another challenge, I think, is that some of the variables that we would be interested in are not necessarily the information that is being assessed and being recorded by police or probation or agencies that work with victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. So we need partnerships between university and community-based researchers and government agencies that hold offender data. And those partnerships are essential for determining guidelines around access to data and working together to streamline methods of data collection and access so that it doesn't place an excessive burden on service providers and their clients, but to provide researchers and policymakers and practitioners with the opportunity to answer these questions and work together to come up with recommendations for improving practice. I think, in summary, complete data from multiple sources is necessary to inform researchers and policymakers and practitioners who are working toward prevention. And continuing public awareness of warning signs and risk factors and available supports is one of the most important tools for prevention. The other thing that I think fits with that is as we increase public awareness about warning signs and risk factors, I think that will improve the quality of data that we see reflected in court reports and in media stories. So it improves interventions and responses to intimate partner violence, but it will also improve the quality of publicly available data.
Thank you very much, Crystal. I think, I always get excited when we have discussions like this in terms of some of the insights that people bring to the discussions around things that we've been talking about. And I think there's been so much that you've said. I've got all these scribbled hand notes here. And I think there's been lots of food for thought for moving forward. And I think, one of the things I've sort of spoken about with many of you before, is that we currently, we talk about our data sources that we use for the CDHP IVP, and they were media and court documents. But as you'll see in our report, we talk about the fact that sometimes our official data, which is very administrative in focus, is often as problematic as the data that we get from media and court documents. So it's about a reconceptualization. This is what my chant is, a reconceptualization of why we collect data. Do we collect it for administrative purposes or for prevention purposes? And so I think much of what you've said, each of you as panelists, in terms of community-driven data, making sure that our definitions don't broaden things and miss the distinctions between the various groups are so important, and understanding community risk assessments as opposed to just individually based risk assessments. So I want to thank the panel profusely for taking the time to spend an hour with us this afternoon and provide your insights from the various populations that we focused on: rural, remote, northern, Indigenous, children, and immigrant and refugee, and some of the great insights that I think you've provided with us and the people that are attending the conference today. So thank you very much.